The stagecoach lurched to a halt in a cloud of dust, its wheels groaning as though the road itself resisted giving up its passengers. Eleanor Hale stepped down onto the packed earth of the street, bare feet sinking into grit and broken glass. She clutched her trunk with both hands, her knuckles pale against the worn leather, and drew her old shawl closer around her shoulders. Beneath the faded fabric, the outline of a paper-wrapped bundle pressed against her side, a wedding dress she could not bear to leave behind. Though the rest of her belongings had been stolen on the trail, her entrance did not stir kindness. Men on the boardwalk leaned back against their posts, chewing tobacco, watching with narrowed eyes. Women paused in their errands, some whispering behind gloved hands, others turning away as if her presence were indecent. A child pointed and asked his mother why the lady had no shoes, but the mother shushed him sharply, dragging him away. The silence that followed was worse than laughter. It was judgment, sharp as a blade. Eleanor's throat burned with shame. Once she had been the preacher's daughter, taught that a woman's worth was found in modesty and prayer. Now she stood in the heart of a frontier town stripped of dignity, wrapped in rags like some penitent beggar. The bandits who robbed her stage on the ridge had left her more than penniless. They had left her marked. She thought of their laughter, of the coarse hands that tossed her clothes into the dirt, and her cheeks flamed though the day was cool. The driver muttered something about schedules, tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, and climbed back to his perch. The stage rattled away, leaving Eleanor alone in the street with the dust curling around her ankles. She straightened her back, though it felt like lifting a stone. Perhaps if she walked quickly, she might find an inn, some place where coin might still buy dignity. But she had only a handful of coins tied in a kerchief, barely enough for bread. The townsfolk shifted, but did not move closer. No one offered a hand. A pair of boys laughed quietly, pointing at the paper-wrapped bundle. Eleanor turned from them, clutching the shawl as though it were armor. It was then that a shadow fell across her. A man had stepped forward from the edge of the street, a tall figure, shoulders squared beneath a worn wool coat. His face bore the scars of some old violence, one stretching from his temple to the line of his jaw, pale against his sun-browned skin. His hat shaded his eyes, but the stillness of his presence silenced even the boys' laughter. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it startled her, warm, smelling faintly of smoke and horse. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. His eyes, when she dared meet them, were steady but distant, as if he carried his own burdens too heavy to speak of. Whispers rippled among the townsfolk. Someone muttered, "Fletcher." Another spat on the ground. She heard the tone, suspicion, resentment. Jonas Fletcher, she recalled vaguely, a man who lived beyond the river, too near to Apache hunting grounds for the town's comfort. She had heard such names before. Men who returned from war changed, who no longer fit in the world that once claimed them. Yet it was he and no other, who placed his hand lightly at her elbow and guided her down the street. She felt every gaze burning into her back as they walked, her bare feet leaving pale prints in the dust. The shame she carried did not vanish, but beneath the heavy folds of his coat she felt, for the first time since the bandits' laughter, a fragile shield against the cold. They left the town behind, the sound of the saloon piano fading into the creak of cicadas and the wind pressing through dry grass. Jonas did not speak, nor did he look back to see if she followed. He walked with the steady gait of a man long accustomed to silence, and she found herself trailing him as though pulled by some unseen thread. When they reached the cabin at the edge of the valley, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky with smoke-colored red. The place was small, logs darkened by weather, a porch sagging beneath its own weight. A rocking chair sat abandoned, swaying slightly though no hand touched it, as if it remembered someone who had once kept vigil there. Inside, the cabin was bare but clean. A rifle rested above the hearth, its barrel polished with care. A few tools hung from nails in the wall, old and scarred but serviceable. Jonas gestured once toward a chair by the fire, then busied himself with kindling, striking a spark that leapt into flame. Eleanor sank into the chair, the coat heavy across her shoulders, the paper-wrapped dress cradled against her knees. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. She felt as though she had stepped from one storm into another, sheltered from the cruelty of the town, yet bound now to a stranger, whose silence was deeper than the night. She lowered her head, the fire's warmth prickling her cheeks. For the first time since the bandits stripped her of her dignity, tears threatened. But she swallowed them down. The world had abandoned her, yes, but in the silence of that cabin, she was no longer entirely alone. The days fell into a pattern that seemed both endless and fragile, like threads stretched across a loom. Jonas spoke little, his voice reserved for necessity, the grunt of effort when he split logs, the scrape of steel against wood as he sharpened a blade, the hollow clink of a tin cup set upon the table. His world was built of labor and silence, each task carried out with the steadiness of someone who asked nothing from life but survival. Eleanor moved quietly within it, as though afraid to disturb the rhythm he had carved for himself. She folded her shawl neatly each morning, tended to her trunk, and the paper-wrapped dress inside as though it were some relic of a life already buried. The cabin told its own stories. The rocking chair on the porch had been worn smooth by years of use, though no one sat in it now. When the wind passed, it creaked forward and back as if remembering. A rifle hung above the hearth, polished, its barrel shining even in the dim light, a weapon cared for not with pride but with ritual. From the rafters dangled braids of dried corn, their husks rattling faintly in draughts, testament to hands that had prepared for winters alone. These details pressed upon Eleanor more than words could, signs that Jonas had lived with silence for so long, it had become companion rather than burden. Her own silence was heavier. In the evenings, when the fire sank low and shadows drew long, memories intruded. She saw again her husband's body carried out from the mine, his face blackened by dust, his hand limp over the stretcher's edge. She remembered the curt words of her kin, how quickly they turned their backs when she refused to remarry for convenience, when she chose dignity over another man's household. Worst of all was the sound of bandits' laughter echoing against the rocks as they stripped her belongings, mocking her womanhood, tossing aside her garments until she stood trembling, covered by nothing but shame. The wound was not just loss of fabric, but the tearing away of her place in the world. At first, she prayed silently, lips moving without sound. Then, finding a fragment of charcoal near the hearth, she began writing in the narrow margins of her small Bible, not verses, those she already knew by heart, but her own pleas, brief as the flare of a match. Lord, keep me unseen. Let me be more than a burden. Do not leave me alone again. She closed the book tightly afterward, as though her words might otherwise slip out and be heard. One evening, rain began to patter against the roof, steady and unrelenting. The smell of damp earth drifted in through cracks in the walls, mingling with wood smoke. Jonas sat at the table with an old saddle, the leather cracked, his hands steady as he worked a needle through with practiced slowness. The lantern cast a small circle of light, gilding the scars that marked his skin, lines that twisted across his knuckles, one deep gash along the side of his hand, where the flesh had healed unevenly. Eleanor sat across from him, her own hands idle in her lap. She studied those scars as the rain drummed overhead, realizing they were not so different from her own unseen ones. Each mark on his hands told of violence endured, just as every silence in her heart told of grief survived. She felt for the first time that she was not an intruder in his world, but a reflection of it. Jonas did not raise his eyes, nor did he speak. Yet she saw in the care he gave the worn saddle, in the patience of his movements, something that resonated within her. A man who had been broken, but had chosen to mend what could be mended. And she, though shamed and cast aside, might still be mended too. She lowered her gaze, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, and drew it back up again with trembling fingers. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, she felt less like a burden waiting for dismissal, and more like a presence allowed to remain. Outside, the rain carried on, washing the night clean. The storm came first as a low growl beyond the ridge, a rumble that trembled through the ground and sent the rocking chair on the porch into a restless sway. Eleanor sat by the hearth, Bible closed in her lap, when the wind struck like a fist against the shutters. The cabin shuddered. Jonas moved with the calm of one long accustomed to such violence from the sky, setting an iron kettle over the fire, checking the latch on the window. Lightning split the darkness, filling the room for a breath with stark white light, and thunder answered so near that the floorboards shook beneath her feet. Then came the knock. It was no polite tapping, but a desperate pounding, rattling the door as if someone meant to tear it from its hinges. Jonas's hand went at once to the rifle above the hearth, but he hesitated only long enough to open the door wide. A figure collapsed across the threshold. A boy, no older than 17, his skin bronzed, his hair black and tangled with rain. Blood smeared his chest where an arrow had grazed him, and his breath came in harsh, broken gasps. Jonas caught him before he struck the ground, lowering him gently onto the rug. The rifle lay forgotten as he reached for strips of cloth, his silence broken only by a steady command to fetch water. Eleanor stood frozen, shawl clutched tight. She recognized the boy's features, the braids at his temple, Apache. Fear quickened her heart. The stories told in town were sharp with warning: raids, ambushes, violence without mercy. She had learned them like gospel, yet here he lay, trembling and drenched, not a warrior but a wounded child. Compassion and fear wrestled within her as the thunder roared again. Jonas worked swiftly, pressing cloth to the wound. His scarred hands were sure, his expression unchanged by the blood. Eleanor moved at last, filling a basin, heating water by the fire until steam rose. She knelt beside them, her fingers trembling as she dipped a rag and pressed it to the boy's brow. He flinched, but she murmured softly, though she knew not what words to say. Her voice itself seemed to calm him, and his eyes fluttered closed. Hooves pounded through the storm. Lanterns bobbed outside, voices shouted, demanding. Jonas stiffened, rising to his full height. He opened the door once more, the rain striking his face, and faced the riders. Their words cut through the wind. Accusations, threats, demands that the Apache youth be surrendered. Eleanor stood behind him, heart hammering. She watched the scarred man she barely knew stand alone against the storm and the men beyond it. His refusal was quiet, steady, spoken with no tremor. The boy stays. His voice carried the weight of finality, a line drawn not with violence, but with resolve. The riders cursed him, one spitting into the mud, another warning he would answer for this defiance. They wheeled their horses, their lanterns swallowed by the night as swiftly as they had come. Jonas closed the door and bolted it, his silence deeper now, his shoulders heavy with knowledge of what he had invited upon himself. The storm beat harder against the cabin walls. Inside, firelight flickered across Eleanor's face as she bathed the boy's wound, washing the blood from his hair with gentle strokes. The water turned pink in the basin. Her hands steadied as she worked, and with each careful movement she felt something within herself stirring, an old tenderness she thought had been buried with her husband, a capacity for care that shame had silenced. She remembered how it felt to be cared for once, how absence had hollowed her, and now she gave what she had once longed to receive. Jonas sat nearby, watching, his expression unreadable. The thunder crashed overhead, rattling the shutters. But within the cabin there was only the hiss of rain on the roof, and the soft rhythm of breath from the boy who now slept. Eleanor glanced at Jonas, and for the first time she saw his silence differently. It was not emptiness. It was not cowardice. It was a shield, a choice, a refusal to bow to cruelty or fear. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, the clash of dread and compassion. Yet here in this fragile space, she felt steadied by the weight of his presence. The night carried on. Long and uncertain, but the cabin endured. Firelight glowed against rough-hewn walls, a fragile sanctuary holding them safe while the storm raged without. The storm passed, but its echo seemed to remain inside the cabin. Days stretched long beneath the low roof, where the three of them shared silence more often than speech. The Apache youth recovered slowly, his wound knitting under Eleanor's careful tending and Jonas's steady vigilance. He did not speak much in English, though he understood more than he let on. His dark eyes watched them both as if he were weighing their measure. At night, when he could not sleep, he set his knife against scraps of pine and carved. the soft scrape filling the quiet where words might have been. For Eleanor, the hush between them grew heavy. She had lived with silence before. Her widowhood had been filled with it. But this silence was different. It pressed against her like a closed door she longed to open. One evening, while Jonas sat sharpening a blade near the fire, she asked, careful as a hand extended toward a skittish horse, "Where did you serve?" Jonas did not look up. "Back east. War took years from me." His answer was flat, pared down to the bone. She waited, then pressed again. "Did you lose anyone?" He drew the stone along steel once more, the rasp long and deliberate, before answering. "Too many. Men I buried, men I should have saved." That was all he gave her, but it was more than nothing, and she held on to it. Another night, when the boy slept soundly, she told her own story in fragments. How her husband had been taken by the earth in a mine collapse, how her kin had closed their doors when she refused to remarry for comfort alone. She admitted, voice low, the sting of being stripped bare by the bandits, how their laughter haunted her more than their theft. Jonas did not interrupt. His silence was not indifference but listening, a steadiness that let her speak without fear. Yet their conversations were not the true tension between them. It was in the unspoken moments, when the shawl slipped from her shoulder as she bent to stir the pot, and she felt his gaze linger before he turned away quickly, jaw tight. When the rocking chair creaked on the porch, though no one sat in it, keeping them both awake, each lying still in the dark, listening to the breath of the other across the small cabin. When her hand brushed his by accident while passing the coffee, and he froze as though struck, before retreating behind his silence again. The youth carved figures at the table each night, his hands deft, his face unreadable. One morning, Eleanor found two of them left where she would see, small, rough forms. One was of a woman holding a rifle, her face tilted skyward. The other of a man, standing guard with broad shoulders and a scar along his cheek. She traced their outlines with her fingertip, the wood rough but alive with meaning. She glanced at Jonas, but he was outside chopping wood, the sound of the axe splitting echoing across the valley. She pressed the carvings close, as though they were her own secret hope, something fragile she was not ready to voice. In the evenings, as lantern light softened the shadows, she found herself watching Jonas. He carried his burdens like stones sewn into his very skin, yet he moved with patience, not cruelty. She wondered if he watched her in turn when she did not see. Perhaps he did. Perhaps that was why his silences grew heavier, as though he feared what might come if they were broken. The cabin became less a shelter and more a crucible. Every glance, every brush of cloth, every question asked or left unspoken was heated in that close air. They were two people marked by loss, bound by circumstance, hesitant to reach for the one thing they both longed for, the warmth of another's hand in the dark. The first warning was the sound of hooves on hard ground, a low thunder rolling across the valley. Jonas heard it before Eleanor did. He set down the axe and reached for the rifle propped against the doorframe. The boy looked up from his carving, eyes narrowing, his small blade paused mid-cut. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, hand raised to shade her eyes. Dust plumed on the horizon, then riders emerged, men she recognized from town, faces twisted by something harsher than concern. They came with shouts and accusations, their voices cutting through the still morning air. One of the older men, gray-bearded and bitter, called up to her, "Eleanor! You don't belong out here. He's not fit company. Come back before worse comes of it." Another jabbed his finger toward the cabin. "And that Indian boy, he's trouble. Hand him over before blood gets spilled." Jonas stepped forward, rifle steady in his hands. His voice was level, though each word carried the weight of iron. "No one here is leaving. You'll turn your horses back." The men shifted uneasily in their saddles, but bitterness burned in their eyes. Eleanor could feel it, the hunger to shame her, to strip away what little dignity she'd reclaimed. Her heart hammered, but she took a step down from the porch, her shawl slipping at her elbows. "You will not tell me where I belong," she said, her voice trembling but rising with each word. "I have already been broken once by men who thought they owned me. I will not be broken again." Her gaze swept the line of faces, daring them to laugh, daring them to cast her down. None did. Silence trembled in the air, until a shot cracked. The youth dove for cover, wood shavings scattering. Jonas shoved Eleanor back, his arm a shield as another shot tore splinters from the doorframe. His rifle barked in return, and one of the men cried out, falling hard from his saddle. The others reeled, guns drawn, horses stamping wild. Then the fire came. A bottle shattered against the cabin wall, flame racing along the dry timber. Smoke curled, then roared upward, heat licking across the porch. Eleanor felt panic seize her chest, but she forced herself forward. "No!" she cried, seizing the bucket from the well. She flung water against the wall, steam hissing. Another flame caught near the roof, and without thinking she tore her shawl free, beating against the blaze until smoke stung her eyes and her arms ached. Jonas fired again, driving the attackers back, his body planted like stone between her and the guns. Chaos raged, shouts, gunfire, horses shrieking, but within it, something steadier rose. Eleanor fought with every fiber, her hair undone, her face streaked with ash and sweat, her shawl blackened at the edges. Jonas turned once, just long enough to meet her eyes across the smoke. In that glance there was no shame, no pity, only the recognition of equals, each fighting to hold what mattered. The men wavered. One, clutching his wounded arm, snarled, but another pulled at his reins, muttering about folly and cruelty. Slowly, like a tide that had lost its surge, they wheeled their horses and retreated, leaving dust and silence in their wake. Eleanor let the bucket fall, her arms too weak to hold it any longer. She stumbled inside, collapsing near the hearth as her chest heaved. The fire was dying on the wall outside, but inside her it still burned, fury, relief, and something else she could not name. Tears cut paths through the soot on her cheeks. Jonas entered quietly, setting the rifle aside. He knelt beside her, not looming, not rescuing, just there. His hands were rough, scarred from years of war and labor. Yet when he reached for hers, he did so with a hesitation that trembled into certainty. Eleanor did not pull away. Her fingers found his, soot-stained and shaking, and held fast. In the hush that followed, the boy watched from the shadows, silent witness to something larger than survival. The cabin still stood, scarred by flame but unbroken. So, too, did the people within it. The fire had threatened to consume them, but it had burned something else away instead, her shame, his solitude. What remained in the ashes was not spoken, only lived. Two scarred souls who had chosen, at last, not to stand alone. The smoke on the cabin wall had long faded, but the air still carried the weight of that night. The townsfolk had not returned, yet whispers drifted across the prairie faster than any rider. By the third day, word reached even Jonas. Soldiers would come, not to protect him, but to punish him for harboring the youth and defying the demands of the settlement. It was the same story written across every frontier, authority cloaked in the language of order, hiding fear beneath its banners. The boy said nothing when he learned. He simply rose before dawn, gathered the few scraps he had carried, and placed two small carvings upon the table, the woman with the rifle, the man standing guard. When Eleanor found them, the chair where he once sat was already empty. He had gone back to his people, vanishing into the hills with the quiet grace of someone who had never truly belonged in their world. His absence pressed on the cabin heavier than his presence ever had. Jonas moved about in silence, packing a saddlebag, laying the rifle across the table, sharpening the knife at his belt. There was no farewell in his movements, but Eleanor read the intent all the same. He meant to ride out alone, to bear whatever reckoning waited, to keep her free of the burden his choices had drawn down upon them both. "You're leaving me," she said softly. Her voice breaking the hush, Jonas did not look up. His jaw tightened, his hands never faltered in their work. "It's safer if you stay." The words fell between them like a sentence. Eleanor felt her breath hitch, anger and grief rising in the same instant. How many times had she been cast aside in the name of safety, propriety, convenience? A husband buried in the dark, a family that turned her away, bandits that stripped her bare, townsfolk that mocked her dignity. Every loss had left her standing alone in the cold. Not this time. She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed, the only relic she had carried into this new life. Inside lay the wedding dress, its fabric still stained with dirt and torn from her humiliating journey. For days she had hated the sight of it, a cruel reminder of what she had been denied. But now, as her fingers brushed across the ruined cloth, she felt something shift. She lifted it, wrapping it about her shoulders like armor, the tattered lace falling around her like a banner not of defeat, but of defiance. When Jonas stepped onto the porch with his saddlebag slung over his shoulder, he found her already waiting, a horse bridled at her side. The morning was gray, mist curling low across the fields, the air cool with the scent of rain. She sat tall in the saddle, the dress trailing ragged at her arms, her hair unbound. Her eyes met his, steady, unyielding. "You ride to face what's coming," she said. "Then I ride with you." For a long moment he said nothing. The wind stirred the scorched timbers of the cabin, carrying the smell of ash and earth. At last he drew a breath, a sound rough as gravel. His gaze flicked from her face to the dress, to the horse beneath her, then back again. Something in his eyes softened, the steel giving way to a quiet surrender. Without another word, he mounted his own horse. They rode side by side through the mist, the land opening wide before them. The fields lay silent, scarred by fire, the horizon veiled in pale light. Neither spoke, for words had always failed them both. Instead, their presence was its own vow, not promises of safety, not guarantees of tomorrow, but the simple, stubborn truth that they would not face it alone. The rhythm of the horse's hooves carried them forward, past the last trace of smoke, past the shame of the town, past all the echoes of lives that had tried to bury them. For the first time since her husband's death, Eleanor did not feel like a widow, or a woman shamed, or a burden cast aside. She felt reborn, the torn dress no longer a relic of humiliation but a mark of endurance, proof that what had been stolen could still be carried forward. Beside her rode a man scarred by war, by betrayal, by silence, but steadfast all the same. The reckoning waited somewhere ahead, but for now, in the hush of dawn, the weight was bearable. She reached across the narrow space between them, her fingers brushing his hand on the reins. He did not draw away. The road stretched on, uncertain and unending, but they faced it together. Two forsaken souls, bound not by vows spoken over altars or the approval of towns, but by the quiet strength of choosing each other at the edge of the world. And as the mist broke into pale sunlight, Eleanor breathed deep, the coat heavy on her shoulders, the wedding dress trailing like a banner behind her. Whatever lay ahead, soldiers, exile, or another kind of fire, she no longer feared it. She was no longer abandoned. She was no longer alone.